In today's equity index futures markets, I want to focus on the NASDAQ today. The NASDAQ outpacing the other major averages, almost 2 to 1 when you look at it relative to the S&P and the Russell, and really to the Dow, it's almost 4 to 1. We're seeing the NASDAQ futures up better than 1% today at new all-time highs. 90.76 is the current level where we're seeing those NASDAQ futures being priced. And again, this rally continues to build on itself as we move through the first 2 weeks here in 2020. And I think it's interesting to point out some of the dynamics within the market now. We are seeing some different indicators here indicating some substantial over valuations in certain areas. And when you look at some of the measurements here, I think it's important to point out one thing is that we're looking at a put-call ratio here at levels that it has not really seen going back to January of 2018. So again, substantial activity as far as that type of measurement is concerned, and certainly has some market observers on high alert here as far as the continued escalation within the equity markets and the futures valuations based on those indexes. Second of all, also I noticed that CNN put out their fear and greed index, and that's at record levels as well. We're seeing that up around levels that it has not seen in quite some time. Again, so you're seeing substantial sentiment shift continuing to evolve as we move through 2020. And as I mentioned last year, it felt like the fear of missing out, it felt like the climbing the wall of worry is now turned into more of the FOMO experience, or the fear of missing out. And that certainly is being demonstrated in those two indicators here as we move into the second full week of trading in January. Looking at some of the dynamics as well as some of the data points in the market structure, I think it's important to point out this week we have a lot of items that could influence the futures moving forward. And certainly when you look at the economic data coming out, inflation-based data, I think the market's going to be very focused on that, because I think that's really where the Fed is viewing the current structure as far as interest rates. And if they continue to maintain the low interest rate environment, that's ultimately beneficial for the equity markets. But if we see inflation start to pick up, then that could definitely change the current dynamics within the market structure. So we have PPI, CPI, and retail sales this week. And also I want to point out that we're going to kick off earnings this week as well, with the banks starting tomorrow morning. So those dynamics will certainly have an impact, more so probably on the S&P and the Dow futures, not so much on the NASDAQ initially, but we will get into the heart of the technology earnings starting next week, and that will definitely influence those NASDAQ futures as we move through the early stages of earnings season.